Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing another really awesome guest involved in creating a better tomorrow for millions of people out there. Today, we have the honor to be joined by Dr. Hernan Bazan, who is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of South Rampart Pharmaceuticals. It's a clinical stage biopharma company focused on developing safer, non-opioid therapies for acute and chronic pain. He spearheads the company's scientific, clinical, and technology development efforts, as well as its fundraising. Dr. Bazan also serves as an academic vascular surgeon, as the John Ochsner Endowed Professor in Surgery and Innovation at Ochsner Health, and his clinical interests include treating carotid artery disease, acute stroke, using minimally invasive procedures and approaches to aortic aneurysms, as well as peripheral arterial disease, and as a result, also managing acute post-operative pain. And over the years, Dr. Bazan has realized the significant clinical and societal need for safer and non-addictive pain relief in both the ambulatory and post-operative settings, leading to the formation of South Rampart. The first manuscripts on these really unique analgesic compounds that have lack of hepatotoxicity, as well as the traditional analgesic and antipyretic properties, was originally published back in 2020, and there's been some follow-up papers. And Dr. Bazan is the PI or co-PI on multiple small business commercialization grants that focus on developing these products, as well as co-inventor of several issued and pending patents, dozens of publications, and his team have recently completed phase 1 clinical trials and are paving the way for phase 2 right now. Dr. Bazan received his undergraduate bachelor's in molecular biology at Vanderbilt, spent 2 years in medical school at Howard Hughes Medical Institute, research scholar at the NIH, earned his MD at Georgetown, followed by general surgery residency at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, and then vascular surgery fellowship at Yale. A lot of really cool topics to get into today. Honored to have him with us. Dr. Hernan Bazan, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Well, thanks so much, Ira. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to be here, and congratulations on your series. It's really remarkable, the people you've had. We were just talking about Dr. Tony Fauci and Craig Venter and Drew Weissman and others, and so really stellar groups of people.
I appreciate that. And now we have Dr. Hernan Bazan, and you're working on truly revolutionary set of opportunities here. But before we get into talking about South Rampart and some of the products that you're developing on pharmacology and all sorts of interesting things like that, take us a little into your background, because your work, done an extensive amount of publications in, as I mentioned in your bio, carotid artery disease, stroke. You've published on everything from aneurysm, stenosis, stenting. Talk a little bit about your own background here, specifically in the cardiovascular and stroke place, and then if you could make just a little connection to some of the issues with regard to post-operative pain that you see in your daily practice. I mean, though you published on some of these, I saw some interesting papers on things like abdominal pain after gastric banding and stuff like that. Walk us into that world, and then we'll talk a little bit about sort of the unmet needs following your background.
Well, thanks for that. It's everything is a journey, right? And so it really started, like we were talking about right before, our times in Bethesda at the NIH, and in an immunology lab. And And it's not so much, I don't think, trying to work on a specific disease state, as I'm sure you did when you were there. It's really just learning the process, right? Learning how to ask the right questions and designing the right experiments. And so that was actually a pretty incredible time working on how HIV enters immune cells, HIV entry. When I was there is when the chemokine receptors were first discovered. Actually, I joined the lab, Dr. Ed Berger's lab at LVD, Lab of Viral Diseases in Building 4. A month after he published the first paper in Science in Fusion, which was you may remember, the first 7-transmembrane cell surface receptor that people had known for about over a decade that there was something else besides CD4 that required for viral entry.
Yep.
And he only had 4 people in his lab, and he was able to do this with a bacteriophage lambda screening library. And he set up a fusion assay, beta-lactidase readout fusion assay, because he was with Bernie Moss, and he had done all of the cloning on vaccinia virus. And I'll tell you a funny story. We were talking about Dr. Fauci. And then, Fauci had a group of like 100 people in his lab, and they were also looking for it. And Ed told me the story that Tony called him into his office and asked him, "So how did you do it?" And Ed told him, and he was just, aghast at how simple and beautiful that screening assay had elucidated the first 7-transmembrane receptor. It just shows you just asking the right questions sometimes leads to, pivotal things. And nowadays there's a therapy towards that, and it really helped explain, viral tropism and other things. And so that was a great time. I got to live on the NIH campus, and had lunch through the Howard Hughes. We'd have lunch with people like Harold Varmus when he was director. With Francis Collins. Other people that would come and give lectures. So it was really interesting, really great, and still have lifelong friends from that time. So then when my wife was in DC, we had actually met at the NIH before, on a summer before when I was doing a summer fellowship. She was working right out of college, and then I did my clinical years where she was at medical school at Georgetown, my 3rd and 4th year. So I went into my 3rd year of medical school thinking I was going into internal medicine and infectious diseases or heme-onc, because that's what I'd been exposed to, on campus. And it's one of those things that I do a lot of now. I did the surgical rotation and just got that bug, got that interest. And a lot of that is mentorship. I had a great transplant surgeon at Georgetown, who was a great mentor. And then from there, we went to New York to Mount Sinai to residency. And there had an amazing mentor, also a vascular surgeon, Dr. Larry Ollier. And so that's what got me into vascular, as well as many other faculty there. And it was a really good ecosystem of that type of field of vascular work that was being done at Mount Sinai at the time in the early 2000s. And during that process, the things that I had learned when I was in Bethesda obviously were long lasting. And I'll tell you, in retrospect, in the late 90s, when we were in med school in DC, I remember people pushing what you may have read about, the 5th vital sign, pain, and chart. And I never put together that was Purdue Pharma doing that at the time. Obviously, no one ever thought of that. But it's, now you go back and you understand how things were happening, different market forces, right?
Sure.
And one of my first interactions with this and the need was I was not on the service at the time, but at Mount Sinai we had a very busy liver transplant service, and this is very rare. But I remember a young woman, probably in her early 20s, that got flown from Miami to New York for an urgent liver transplant because she had overused a liver toxic medication, and so as that was when we treat patients, we do a lot of surgery. I just actually between surgery this morning, and we have obviously opioids, and then we have the over-the-counters, the non-steroidals, ibuprofen, Advil, and acetaminophen, Tylenol, and they all have their issues. Obviously, the abuse potential of opioids, the kidney injury and gastrointestinal GI lining from ibuprofen, Advil, especially in the elderly. GI bleeding is a big issue, or kidney toxicity. I've had patients that have gone on dialysis just from shoulder overuse, from shoulder osteoarthritis. or acute liver injury from acetaminophen overuse. And now we have so much obesity in the US, so much NASH, that's an issue, and has been. We can talk about this. It's very timely because just last week, Vertex got FDA approval for acute pain of a new target. And I think that's really positive for the pain space because the market has perceived it in a certain way that I'm hoping it will be, where many of us are hoping will be very positive for the development of newer targets like we have and like others have. Because for many years, people stayed away from pain because it had been so problematic. Because I think before there weren't good targets, the studies weren't well conducted, the trials didn't have clear endpoints, there wasn't good science behind it. And so investors stayed away from it. I think the market signals are such now that hopefully there are more eyes and ears on it. We can get into that, but that's sort of a niche. So now I have a great partners in the audience at Ochsner Health. I run our fellowship. So these are people that have done already 4 years of med school, 5 years of residency, trying to do 2 extra years of training. So that what we call postgraduate years 6 and 7. It's a fantastic way of complementing the life science biotech that we're doing just to be able to every day also treat patients and affect patients.
Excellent. And just to put this in our audience's mind a little more, and I'll bring these two together and I'll let you go with this one. So on one hand, pain, and you point this out on the South Rampart website, we're talking about $750 billion when we put it all together, and talk about the direct and indirect costs, whether acute, chronic, post-operative, cancer. The whole basket is huge. A lot of problems, as you just mentioned, with opioids, NSAIDs, and the acetaminophen. And a very weird situation. And I just, I'm a pharmacist by undergraduate training, and I had my couple semesters of pharmacognosy. All 3 of these classes go back to the mid-1800s. And it's an odd thing that when you think about it, and we've done a lot of shows on things like antimicrobial resistance rate lately, and talking about no one's developing antibiotics anymore, and we got a real problem. Talk a little bit. Talk about the space in general in terms of the market we're looking at here, and say a couple more words about it, because about the Vertex approval, and over the years, I profiled things like people looking at cone snail toxins and all sorts of other things that don't act. This is one of the sort of the severe pain areas. Talk about why things haven't really moved much in the last century on and that these 3 options with addiction, kidney damage, and liver damage are what sort of like the mainstay is in 2025.
Yeah, it's an incredible history. And so I can give a few instances that are pretty remarkable. For example, number one, you can go back into the mid 80s, I think it is. There's a New England Journal of Medicine, basically a small piece. It was a note, and I have it. I can send it to you afterwards for your listeners if they want to see it. It was basically a small 3-4 sentence note written in the New England Journal of Medicine by someone in Boston that said, we don't see addiction in patients that are being treated with opioids. And basically, they said something like there were 2 or 3 out of 1,000 or so. And as remarkable as it sounds, and it was just a opinion piece. It was like a letter. And so there's that aspect. Now, obviously, the way that was discovered and used goes back well over 100 years. And, that's one class. And I think people didn't realize as it was being developed, all of the abuse potentials and respiratory and constipation and nausea and all the other opioid adverse effects. It's interesting, the acetaminophen story, the Tylenol story, because that was discovered really by accident around the turn of the century in the early 1900s. And then it wasn't really picked up again until the 1950s. And then McNeil Laboratories really championed it, and then J&J took it. And it really had its moment when Ray's syndrome came out, and as sort of like a black box warning for children and aspirin. And so from a marketing point of view, that really, really, really took off. And I think people just accepted that there was a liver injury and that was it, because the only other thing were NSAIDs that are very good at anti-inflammation. The kidney and the GI toxicity, people just have accepted it. And it's funny you mentioned antimicrobials, antibiotics. It's the same thing that is happening in the pain space. The market, when you talk to investors, they don't see much of a market for antibiotics. You would say to the layperson, like, oh yeah, there's so many drug resistance. That's a great market. But the problem is they're only used for 7 days, 10 days, 14 days, very expensive to develop. So there's not much of a significant return on investment for people that are set out to develop novel antimicrobials, as sad as it is, because yes, we do have a tremendous amount of antibiotic resistance with VRE and other things, MRSA and other things, and MRSE. So it's not only the clinical need, but it's also who will support that development. And I think understanding these things is important so that you can actually do something meaningful to help patients and to help society and to have a successful venture, so that the people that put faith in that venture have a reward that then they'll support other similar things in that field. And antibiotic is a perfect example, sort of what had happened with pain for about 10 years.
Mm-hmm. I know one other thing I wanted you to talk about for a couple of minutes, and then we'll get into South Rampart. I worked for several years alongside my father and learned quite a bit from him. And I couldn't help but notice that, well, one, your dad is a preeminent neuroscientist, and he works with you alongside at South Rampart. Obviously, the connections between, well, obviously cardiovascular neuroscience, a lot of it converges in areas of inflammation and pain and so forth. But also you could say a couple words about your father and, a little bit of work. I enjoyed working with my dad. We got in a lot of fights. We did good business together, but say a couple words about your father, if you would.
Sure. It's funny you asked that. I remember I was presenting once to a venture group in the Mid-Atlantic, and one of the guys on the call said, nope, we're not interested at all, because I've seen when there are family-related ventures that are working together, it's a mess. And so basically, we're not interested. And so I just smiled and said, okay, well, thank you for your time, and, moved along. And obviously, we've been able to move along since. So, there is that perception. He's a fairly remarkable person. We came to the U.S. from Argentina in 1981, and we were 5 children, and he and my mother, and we pretty much didn't have anything. He had a faculty position. We left during the military regime, and he led all of that, and basically, was in his early 40s, and you can imagine how stressful that is. And he had a faculty position and at the medical school at the LSU School of Medicine in New Orleans, but didn't really have much else. And there were other obstacles, and was able to create. And I think that's one of the things about, I was 9 years old. I think that's one of the things about the American dream that we all know about, and the immigrant stories that, then they have the ability to push forward because they understand the other sides of things. And so, yeah, he's been able to have a lot of success. He created the Neuroscience Center. Currently, I think there are about 80 plus people in his group, about 12 PIs. He's mentored multitude of people that have gone on to be faculties and directors and chairs. The one thing that I've learned from him is the power of collaboration. Collaboration really is innovation, because you can't ever do everything yourself, right? You have to bring in the right people and then let them do what they do. And it's actually, I think, a strength to sometimes be out of the field, because you can see things a little differently. And that's why in biomedical research, people say it's really good to have a clinician's perspective, because sometimes you look at things a little differently. Same thing with science. You look at things differently when you look at some clinical problems. So, right. Or with engineering, or with medicinal chemistry. So it's been good. He's been extremely the tremendous value that's been added is the extensive molecular techniques that are available there. We just published a paper on single-cell genomics using the 10x Genomics platform. He's got a few very gifted postdocs and junior faculty, a couple that I shared the first authorship with on the paper, on the last paper in May. And so it's a remarkable group, and that has allowed to generate a lot of knowledge. So then, without having to waste resources on going somewhere and buying equipment or renting equipment or leasing equipment and so on, and being able to, with a very good arrangement with the medical school in terms of how we pay the fees, so that we can move the technology forward in an efficient way. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of good interaction, and I think we've learned a lot from each other. Obviously, me much more than him, and it's a tremendous source of not only science but also some business experience too, because he had been involved with several groups around the world in the past, and that's really how we started. So when I was able to we were able to start with someone, a regulatory person in North Carolina. Once we started growing, we had sort of outgrown him, but those kinds of contacts help a lot. And that's why whenever you do a venture, having the right team is so important. There's that saying that, people would rather bet on a B technology, but an A team rather than the other way around. And then I think what that speaks to is, obviously you want to have the best technology possible, but it speaks to the importance of the team. Mm-hmm. And having those interactions and experiences brings you that experienced team.
Yeah. No, I wanted to highlight that because I had great experiences working with my own father and learned a lot from him. And I think it's important. And he's not, again, he's a pretty preeminent neuroscientist. So I think it's an important part of what you're doing here, especially as we get into the mechanisms and the pharmacology of what's happening here. Let's go there now, because I think it's a very exciting thing. So you formed South Rampart Pharma, as you're mentioning. And, the core of what you're working on is something known as SRP-001. And I'll let you walk us through this. But sort of just the top line that I was able to take away is that, hey, we have this compound that has a very interesting combination of mechanisms, in the sense that it sort of does what acetaminophen normally does in working it, sort of the endocannabinoid transporter, and some of these other, in terms of voltage-gated ion channels and amyloid receptors and all that sort of thing. I know Tylenol is kind of a shotgun set of mechanisms, which is cool. But you're not making the nasty hepatotoxic metabolites that you would normally see with acetaminophen. And then sort of the third aspect of this, and I'll throw it back to you, and this sort of relates to some of your father's work. We don't normally think of acetaminophen as having an anti-inflammatory effect, but at certain doses can. And in this case, how it impacts prostaglandin synthesis and all that, COX-2 enzymes. Take a little time on this. I know there was a major publication on sort of the transcriptomic signatures and all that. I think it's a beautiful little story pharmacologically, and I want you to spend a little time on it.
Sure. The origin of this it's a library of compounds that we did with in collaboration with a medicinal chemist in Spain at the University of Alcalá. And so he's named on the parent patent, and he's on the original paper that I wrote as the leading author. And he and someone else in his group, we published that in September 2020 in the European Journal of Medicinal Chemistry. Mm-hmm. And the differentiator is a linker in the middle of the molecule where there's the analgesic or pain relieving fragment called a benzene sulfonamide. And that benzene sulfonamide linker, what it does is it leads to, in the metabolism in the liver, the avoidance of a toxic metabolite called NAPQI, NAPQI. And that's a benzoquinamine that in high doses, this has been known since 1983 in the Journal of Biological Chemistry and JBC publication, that leads to acute liver injury through proteinated ducts and other issues when there's basically an overdose of acetaminophen. So this is a new chemical entity, NCE, that's over twice the molecular weight. And not only does it avoid the liver injury, but it also has a very rapid uptake, the PK, the pharmacokinetics. And that's basically the way that it was made a little hydrophobic and that also has led to a very remarkable half-life, which is what we saw in the phase 1 trial. Half-life after 10.1 hours. Normally, the usual medicines are 2 to 3 hours, 3 to 4 hours. And that has to do with the way the chemistry is. It's had a very rapid uptake, very high Cmax of 1 hour with a bimodal distribution. So the foundational chemistry is, yes, it's that benzene-sulfonamide linker avoids the formation of the benzoquinamine NAPK. So it forms its own benzoquinamine, but it is not liver toxic. Because it's not an NSAID, it's not a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, it doesn't lead to liver injury at high doses. And obviously, we've seen this in not only in the animals that we had to show to the FDA, but also in the phase 1 humans. And obviously, as a non-opioid, it doesn't have abuse potential because it doesn't affect the opioid receptors. It does through the main target is production of AM404. AM404 is sort of the final common pathway that leads to the pain relief, the analgesia, when it gets formed centrally in the brain. In the PAG region, the periductal gray area, in the midbrain, that's where the pain sensing area is. And so when you look, for example, you mentioned acetaminophen, when you look at that on a molar basis, so the actual mole amount compared to SRP-001, our lead asset on a mole amount, the amount of AM404 that's produced with SRP-001 is significantly higher. And why that is, it may be just more efficient production, but it is that's what we published in 2024 in the May in Scientific Reports. We published not only, so we first demonstrated that a radio-labeled SRP-001 does cross the blood-brain barrier. It does get taken up in the PAG region in the midbrain because we had a radio labeled and we could find it there. We could measure it with mass spec, LCM, SMS. And then we could measure that there was on a equal molar basis, more AM404 produced. So we were very delighted to see that because then our thought is not only can we dose higher because there's a wider therapeutic index because of the lack of liver tox at high doses, as well as the lack of kidney injury from NSAIDs or GI toxicity or opioid abuse. It also produces more of this end product that you mentioned, the cannabinoid receptors, and that's one of the targets of AM404. As you could see in that paper, yes, it also affects some ion channels and other things at a single cell genomics level. It affects three gene pathways that are involved in pain: the endocannabinoid, the mechanical nociception, and then something called the fat acetamide hydrolase, which is how AM404 is produced. I know that's a lot of science, but basically those are the main mechanisms of action. And that's what gives us the impetus to move forward because we act centrally in the brain and through, you could say, a clinically validated mechanism of action. So for example, acetaminophen Tylenol works also through AM404, albeit at a slightly lower level. And we know that that's pretty good for minor pain and some headache. I'll tell you, in the hospital, we use IV Tylenol post-operatively at a high dose, and it works really well for minimizing the need for Dilaudid or morphine for post-op. So after a gynecological surgery or midline laparotomy, IV Tylenol is used to decrease the amount of opioid use or even take it away. The issue is obviously you can't use it for a long period of time because of its toxicity. So that's a good predicate that, again, dosing at high SRP-001, we hope to be able to then get into the moderate to severe pain. Because the pain space is right now, opioids are up here in terms of how well they treat pain, and then the other currently available medicines are down here, NSAIDs and Tylenol. And there's this gap, and that's what the market has now confirmed with Vertex's asset, that there's this gap, and that yes, it's significant. And that was a big unknown for, I would say, 15, 18 years, whether there would be a market for that. There's definitely a clinical need, just like there's a clinical need for novel antibiotics. The question is there going to be appetite to develop it? And a huge supporter of this has been the NINDS. And there's a program called the HEAL Initiative, Help into Addiction Long Term. And that program was started by Congress now almost 6 years ago to develop novel non-opioids. And so that has been a tremendous support, of heavy peer review science that has allowed us to develop a lot of this. And there are also other assets that are being developed by others.
Yeah. So clearly unmet need is huge. Really cool pharmacodynamic, pharmacokinetic magic going on, interesting mechanisms. We have the previous acetaminophen proxy, and you were mentioning, where we know that potentially we raise the doses there without the toxicity. There's a lot more potential for those mechanisms. Take us into the clinical world. I mean, I know the pipeline has, SRP-001 is the core of this, and you're looking at everything from acute pain to ocular pain, chemo pain, post-surgical, of course, right up your alley. Talk us through what's happened to date. I know you finished phase 1, you're lining up phase 2, but take us a little into where this is all going.
Well, I think the very best thing that we can do, and anyone in a position like ours can do, is just really test it in the best model that will give us the best confidence that it works or doesn't work.
Right.
And so a great model for acute pain, for moderate to severe acute pain, are wisdom teeth pulls or third molar extraction. A couple of years ago, I met a really interesting gentleman, Dr. Todd Bertoch, who's in Salt Lake City, Utah. We met at we've seen each other at a couple of meetings, and we've interacted. In fact, he and I were emailing last night. And so he's got a pretty extensive expertise on acute pain trials. And in fact, he presented Vertex's data at the annual anesthesia meeting in October because he was PI one of their acute trials. And so he's got a great depth of expertise. Because of the way that SRP-001 works, very rapid uptake with a nice bimodal, we think that the third molar wisdom teeth pull is going to be a really good model to test it, to determine how it works. And the beauty of that model is that these are people that are in their mid-20s, so they're healthy. They don't really have diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, other co-founding disease states that can sometimes make variable the endpoints, because at the end of the day, pain is subjective, and one is trying to objectify something that's subjective. So you want to try to have as much of a homogeneous group as possible early on to be able to get confidence from what the endpoints are like. And so we've developed the protocol in the best way possible to ask this question: does it work? And how good is it compared to placebo? And how much less are the opioid requirements in terms of medication compared to others? And so that's what we're setting out to do. And as you can imagine, that's costly. And so what we are now doing is in finishing out the fundraising round to be able to execute that trial. And my hope and expectation is that we can do that by mid this year. The beauty of that study also is that it's quite fast. So a 200 subject study can be done in about under 4 months with data readout for another month, and then writing the documents to the FDA submission in another month. So obviously preparing for it takes a couple of months, and we've already started the scale synthesis and the formulation work of the placebo, and then there's going to be 2 doses, low and high dose at 001. That's ongoing. So if we can have success, our hope and expectation is to have the results by the end of fourth quarter 2025 this year. And I think that's going to be really another nice addition to the pain space, because it's going to be a new target. Vertex's compound that's now approved for acute pain works in the periphery. This is something that's centrally acting. We don't expect there to be any off-target effects because it doesn't affect sodium channels directly. And so we're hopeful that this will be something that will add to a lot of information that can help continue its clinical development. At the end of the day, Ira, I think that pain is going to be something like hypertension. It's going to be multimodality. In hypertension and high blood pressure, you have different classes of drugs, right? You have calcium channel blockers, ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, diuretics. I think the effective treatment of pain is going to be a few different classes. And that's sort of what the market has opened with how they valued, Vertex's news when they came out with the positive, more recently, the positive FDA approval. The market, I think, cap went up like 7 billion. And then in December, they put in a press release a phase 2 trial in chronic lower back pain where their asset sort of did similar to placebo, and the market read that as about a 13 billion loss over 2 days, which you could say that's really bad, but it's actually really good because it shows how the market perceives that space, how important it is, which up until then, we hadn't really had those signals. I was in New York 2 years ago at the BioCO and Investor Conference on a panel on pain therapeutics in New York with someone named Dave Thomas from Biotechnology Innovation Organization. And what Dave did is he produced, in a 5-year gap, an industry report on the pain space. And basically, this is quite famous now, that the dearth of investments into pain because of the reasons that we had discussed before. And so compared to, say, cancer or cardiovascular disease. And again, there were many reasons for it, but I think all of these activity that have been happening now in the past several weeks, obviously it's been years to get here, is opening up for new developments and new targets that I think hopefully will then benefit patients in society.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I again, I'm excited about it, and especially as you're pointing out, this amazing gap that exists between where we are in terms of the NSAIDs and acetaminophen and the opioids on one end, and yeah, I think you have an amazing opportunity there, especially in terms of sort of whatever we call it, the opioid sparing effects of having these products available earlier on, and yeah, I again. I'm excited about it, and it's I was looking forward to talking to you about this, and it seems like again you put together a great team, you have the right contacts and contractors to get this done, and it looks like you're operating the very quite lean model, which is always hot and for biotech. Talk a little, and again I bring this up just because of my own curiosity, but clearly you have the portfolio purely focused on pain, and that makes a lot of sense. But then feeding back for a minute to your father's work, because very active in neurodegeneration, but also neuroinflammation, Alzheimer's disease, all the pro-inflammatory cytokines and all that stuff. Acetaminophen has also been looked at, as a substance in the past for repurposing. All right, repurposing is such a hot thing nowadays. We've done several episodes on it, and I was just I took a look before we were chatting about all the things that acetaminophen with its nasty side effects has been repurposed for, everything from bacterial infections to tardive dyskinesia to sepsis to sort of dopamine disorders, neurodegeneration. As you hang out, you chat with your dad about sort of the once you're generating billions of dollars in a couple of years on this one. Visions for sort of the future of SRP-001 or related substances beyond pain. What do you talk about?
So I think that's a pretty insightful set of questions. I think the quick answer is it has to really go down to mechanisms and trying to understand the molecular level. How is it really affecting it? So our goal is to develop this towards acute pain. And then because of its PK and pharmacokinetics and the bimodal distribution for chronic pain, we also have a really, really neat model for neuropathic pain, which is a big problem, not only in diabetics, we just see a lot for chemotherapy, cisplatin-based chemotherapy. And then you have ocular pain. Yes, that's one of the ideas, is to then make topical for eye pain and serrations and so on. Beyond that, there are totally other sets of compounds, and this is more in his purview that he has been developing for stroke and neuroprotection. We worked on that a little bit a few years ago, but then it was an issue of trying to have a real good commercial development focus, and that's why we are exiting this basket. But and that's the beauty of basic research, right? You come up with foundational things that then you have no you don't, the way that you can apply them are pretty incredible. Just like you had Dr. Drew Weissman from UPenn, with all the work that he did with RNA, and I'm sure at that time he was not predicting all of the implications that could be done with RNA vaccines and so on. So yes, there are some really neat early preclinical stage foundational mechanisms that they've developed on stroke and for TBI, traumatic brain injury. But they're totally different related compounds. And obviously he started that, so he has generated those IPs to protect them and to, try to develop. And at the end of the day, for these kinds of things, as you well know, you mentioned the team. Yes, it's bringing the right team and executing, and to be able to do that, it's so competitive and there's so much work that you need to be focused on, okay, getting it forward. Some people function, they discover, and then they license it out early on to their tech transfer office, and they're like, you do what you can with it. And that's fine, but I don't think anyone's going to have the same passion that you will to try to develop it. And so a lot of things just die there. Or they say, okay, open an IND, an investigational new drug application with the FDA. By the way, the NIH calls that a commercial success. If you open up an IND, that's the definition of a phase 3, phase 1, phase 2 grants, and phase 3 is when you open an IND. But that's just an IND. You're just barely, now you can get it into the clinic for phase 1 testing. Our approach has been to put as much value creation and develop this as much as we can to demonstrate efficacy so that we can then decide what are the next steps rather than leaving it behind early.
Yeah, no, you're clearly on the right path. Again, I was just coming back to, going back to the 1800s again and thinking about the day that someone realized, wow, this stopped my pain, and we didn't know how things were working and mechanisms of action 100 and some odd years ago, but it's always interesting to brainstorm a little bit and think. But no, you're definitely on the right path, and I think you got so much potential there. So I'm excited about it. Hernan, what's coming up for 2025 that we should know about? Obviously, you have the fundraising and the milestones of the clinical. Any other public-facing stuff while we have you today in terms of other conferences, whether scientific conferences, investor conferences, anything else on the horizon in the coming months that we should know about while we have you today, please?
Probably there are two real good ones that I would point out. Bio in June. The innovation organization. Last Bio in San Diego, I chaired the pain therapeutics and innovation and strategies session, and it was great because I had a business development person from Merck, an investment banker from the Boston area, actually Dr. Todd Bertoch, who again is one of the Western world's foremost experts on clinical trial development for pain, and a gene therapy woman founder, and then I had actually a program director from the NIH, from the HEAL program, NINDS. So it was a really good interdisciplinary. So that's an incredible conference. This year, I'm sure there'll be a lot of activity and a lot of interest in CNS innovation. And the other one that's a little smaller, that's in October, it's almost like a Keystone conference. It's run by someone named Dr. Bill Schmidt. It's the Arrowhead Pain Therapeutics Summit in October. That's usually either in Boston or the West Coast. And he does a great job of bringing, it's all focused on pain, and he has a great job of bringing thinkers to it. That's usually no bigger than 150 people, and it's very intimate and really good discussions. Outside of that, I think it's putting our head down and just doing the clinical work and moving forward, because that's what really the data is what drives the success and the endpoints.
Well, As I said, I'm excited. I'm rooting you on, and I just, look forward to continue to follow what you're doing, and wish you the best in the phase 2, as well as the, future money raising. And yeah, excited for you and wishing you the best with the company and your team. Again, for everybody that's going to be listening to this episode of our show across the podcast networks or joining on the YouTube channel, again, even spending time with Dr. Hernan Bazan, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder, South Rampart Pharmaceuticals, also John Ochsner, Endowed Professor of Surgery and Innovation. Hernan, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us for a little while about what you're up to. Obviously, thank you for everything you're doing for this extremely unmet medical need. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for literally millions of people out there that require these therapeutics. Really an awesome story.
I really enjoyed it, Ira. Thanks so much for having me. And again, congrats on what you've done here. And I encourage your listeners to go back and there are some really cool and interesting people you've had on. So keep up that great work. Really enjoyed it.
Much appreciated. Be well.